All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for June 5th, 2023. Thanks to everyone for attending. I know we've been flip-flopping on dates and times for a bit, but thanks for making it through that. And we're back to our usual time for now, though certainly attendance is always helpful to keep track of so we can know what works best for people. And on that note, while we're getting started here, if you can write your name on the attendees list here. We've been trying to do this more recently just to, again, track what times work best for people. We've been getting pretty good attendance at the earlier times, but also good to understand the attendance we're getting at our more traditional time, which is now. So if you can add your own name to the agenda, again, I'll drop a link in chat and go ahead. With that said, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, which means we abide by the Kubernetes code of conduct. Largely just means to be nice to each other. So yeah, never had an issue with that. But yeah, just please everyone be nice. If you think of it, please rely on Zoom's feature to raise your hand so we can make sure that everyone has a chance to say their piece as we go through this. And with that, let's get to the agenda. First on the list is actually something that Shane wanted to remind everyone about. Shane may make it to the later half of this meeting, but unfortunately has a conflict right now. So he just wanted to remind everyone that this timeouts gap is getting awfully close. I think we talked about this last week as well. But it is just, I think, in its final stages. I think, Nick, you may have already given LGTM, not quite, but we're pretty close on this one, I think. So if you see anything in here that you don't want to merge, please take a look at today or tomorrow, because I think our goal is to get this in this week. That's the timeouts gap. This includes 2 timeouts directly on HTTP route. One is a request timeout, and the other is a per try timeout. This is obviously there. Go ahead.
Backend. It's the timeout to the backend from the connection to the gateway to the backend. Whereas the request timeout is the sort of overall request timeout. That one is important for implementers to check out, because it is currently proposing that the request timeout be a core conformance field. So if you don't think that you're going to be able to do that request timeout, that's pretty important for you to sing out now, because I'd really prefer not to be adding something to the API that is core that not everybody can do, or that most people can't do. So yeah, if you are an implementer, please check that out.
Yeah, definitely. And we have, unlike some of our other core fields, there's a little bit of flexibility here in terms of how the timeout is interpreted. And I think any conformance tests for this will just, have something that takes longer than, say, a 10-second or whatever our test timeout is to return and ensure it times out. But yes, please do take a look at this. Want to make sure the language in this gap is something that is implementable by as many people as possible. Yeah, okay. So that is 1742 timeouts. I don't think Frank is on this call, but thank you to him for all the work on this one. Now, seeing a question in chat from Igor.
Yeah, so issuing of API tokens, again, doing like a JOT style user authentication or something like that is something that we've talked about, but it's a reasonably complicated use case to sort of define in the broad terms that we need to talk about for the API. So right now we are planning, I certainly would like to have something like that happen, but like it's a ways away from sort of being implementable. By a ways away, I mean months to, yeah, it's at least next calendar year before we will get to this and even start looking at it. So
I definitely would encourage, if you're interested, we can try and find a link to Slack. But if you just scroll up in Slack a week or so, my reference to time is not great here, but there was a discussion about this in Slack, and there's a few people that are interested in working on a gap around this. This is absolutely, an idea, like Nick said, that we'd love to have in the API itself. Envoy Gateway kind of got out ahead of the curve and has implemented this with custom route filters, which is great. But hopefully we can bring this back into the API. And especially if you're considering, building something custom for your own implementation, if you could, take some of that effort and instead redirect that to something that's, an API standard instead, that would be amazing. But this is definitely in scope for the API. It's just not something we've gotten to yet. So great question. Cool. All right, next on the agenda, I don't think Costin is on the call. Yeah, okay. So I will just try and very briefly cover this idea that one of the core ideas with this API, and like many Kubernetes APIs behind it, is that even after an API reaches beta or soon to be GA, we will continue to add fields to it. And we will do everything we can to ensure that any new fields will be added in a backwards compatible way. And in Kubernetes, what that means is it means the default value of that field cannot change the behavior in any way. So you can have values of that field that change the behavior, they just can't be the default. Now, what this really sheds light on is that we need a way for implementations to understand that they are working with CRDs newer than what they understand. And so we've built that into the API with a common label on CRDs that is the bundle version. And it basically says, this is the version of the API you're interacting with. And then you can know pretty clearly, okay, there may be things that I don't know about because this is a newer version that I'm aware of. And you can surface a warning, some such thing. This is something we need implementation guidelines for. We don't have that right now. We definitely, it's one of those things where the mechanism is there, but the guidance isn't sufficiently clear around this. But yeah, that's at least my thought on this one. I don't know, Nick, do you have anything to add, or anyone else?
Yeah, I think that I can understand how this might be concerning for people, but this is one of the things that the Kubernetes API guidelines, the API conventions and the API changes docs are all about, is making sure that when you make changes, you're making them in a way that's that is backwards compatible. And a large part of that is, as Rob says, that when you add new things, that the default value can't change the behavior. The slightly sucky part about that is that, if say we found a security problem or something like that, generally that means that you can't fix the security problem by changing a default, right? Like you have to sort of say to people, hey, you got to do this. Don't think that should arise too much, because the security stuff we have been doing has been about referential integrity, i.e. reference grant, rather than security controlling fields in general. And I think the stuff that we conceivably will be adding in the future is going to be extensions or new fields where it starts out slightly looser and you can tighten it down if you want. And that's the sort of the approach that we're going to be going with.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Okay, well, let me just keep on moving then.
Sorry, I did remember one, just looking at that thing, I did remember one other thing. One of the things that Costin was worried about was pruning. In that, so a very quick tour through this, for those of you who don't know, by default, Kubernetes CRDs have a thing called pruning enabled. Pruning is when, if you supply a YAML, for example, that has fields that the API server cannot deserialize, it will just drop them on the floor. So if you this applies to sort of adding new fields to the API, in that if you are a user and you try and add a V1 gateway object, but installed in the cluster is the V1 Alpha 2 version of gateway, and there are new fields in the one, those things will be thrown away, and you won't get unless the controller implements something that says, hey, you tried to apply something, and even then the controller won't see it, unless you have a validating admission controller that looks out for newer versions than the ones you support, which would be nuts. You're not going to know that your stuff has been dropped on the floor until you get the thing. This is another thing that we need to put in sort of user guides. You should always get your object back out of the API server to check that the value that you have is what you expected. If you're not sure about the Kubernetes, about the CRD version. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that one. That's an API machinery thing that is very baked into the way CRDs work. And not doing pruning has even worse trade-offs.
Yeah, it is a not intuitive failure mode where things just silently get dropped, but that is the unfortunate state. Yeah. Okay, so one more thing, just an FYI, but also, very interested in comments on this. For those of you who may be familiar, Kubernetes services have an app protocol field on port. And one of I think it's Kubernetes 127, we introduced the concept of implementation defined prefix names. So if, for example, your company, your implementation supports a custom non-standard protocol that isn't in our standard list, this would be one way to communicate that, which is somewhat helpful, but it does mean that if you're trying to work on a service that other custom, implementations are also trying to build on top of, it's really hard to do interop with this. So a kind of the next set, the next iteration of this might be to have a list of app protocols instead of a single app protocol for this. This is something that Lior has proposed in upstream Kubernetes, but honestly, although this is going through K/K, it is, the people that consume this specific field are gateway API implementations and ingress implementations, which there's a ton of overlap between the people that are implementing ingress and the people that are implementing gateway. So really trying to make sure this idea makes sense, would be useful, more broadly. So I think one of the other examples of this is even in a non-standard situation where you have an underlying application that supports, multiple protocols, there's not a way to define that today. Having a list might get you one step closer to that. But recognize that every change like this involves complexity, involves more cycles to implement, etc. So trying to gauge interest level and get some more discussion here. I see that Dave, Arco, and John have already responded. But yeah, please add your thoughts here as well. Would love to see where we go with this. To add a little bit more context, I think, Dave, you have already worked on something that would add WebSockets as, having a formal definition as an app protocol. Is that correct? Not to put you on the spot or anything. But there's a corresponding cap for that, I believe, coming soon. So yeah, just adding a constant for that. Cool. Okay, so that's app protocol. Please again take a look. Yeah. All right. Let's keep on moving then. KubeCon Chicago is coming up awfully soon. The CFP always closes way sooner than I'm ready for. In this case, it is June 18. That gives us less than 2 weeks from today. So just a reminder, the last couple KubeCons, we have offered basically a way to coordinate. So if you just want to reach out to Gateway maintainers, myself, Nick, Shane, any one of us, or all of us, what we've done is, if you're interested in speaking at KubeCon, we may be able to hook you up with someone else, connect dots if you're both interested in talking about a similar topic, or if you just have an idea you want to talk about and want to make sure it's not overlapping with another talk submission, we can help with that. Or if you're looking for ideas, any of those kinds of things, we can help, make sure, help review talk submissions as they come in. I've been around a few KubeCons by now. I think same could be said for Nick, Shane, all of us. So I'm happy to help however we can. We've had, great attendance, great talks at previous KubeCons related to Gateway API. So definitely, let us know and see how we can, see how we can coordinate on this. I think Chicago is going to be a big KubeCon for us. We are hoping to be GA by that KubeCon. And so, should be lots to talk about. Awesome. And cool that there's already at least one talk submitted. So cool. All right. If there's nothing on that, I'll keep on going. All right. Next steps for policy. We've kind of been circling around this policy issue for a while, and there have been some discussions. I've met with Flynn and Shane and Nick, and there's been a variety of discussions. There's been a PR, there's been a GitHub discussion all around this topic. And for anyone not following or not following very closely, it would be very easy to be lost in this process. So my goal was just, in the next couple minutes to summarize where we're at. I think there's broad agreement that we made mistakes in this policy attachment process, in the sense that we let a pattern, which was policy attachment, stick in experimental for a long time without revisiting it as thoroughly as we would like, or building on it. I think we when we introduced policy attachment, we really hoped that it would go, we would build all these really cool things on top of it to make it easier to understand. And unfortunately, it just kind of sat in its kind of experimental state for quite a while. So one of the things that, we're working on is trying to avoid that from happening in the future. So developing guardrails around APIs and patterns to ensure they don't just get stuck in experimental forever. In upstream Kubernetes, we had a similar problem where concepts would either get stuck in alpha or beta for a very long time and never graduate, just because, well, they're out, they kind of work, and we'll just leave it there.
Ingress.
Ingress is a prime example of that. I think it stayed in beta for around 5 years, which is, forever in Kubernetes years. So that's a big learning experience. I think policy attachment is such that there are good patterns in here. There's certainly some significant UX issues we're working to clean up, but there are people that have built APIs on top of this, and we want to ensure that investment is worthwhile. And so again, the plan is to continue with this pattern and improve it. So with that said, Nick and Flynn are working on an update to the GAP that merges in Flynn's great work. He's put in a lot of effort to describe some of the things that can happen with the current model and ways you can get stuck and trapped with it. And so Nick and Flynn are working together to define that problem statement more clearly. While in parallel, we're also working on some first steps to improve that. I don't know, Nick, do you want to add any more context just on that problem statement itself? or
Yeah,
what you're working on?
Broadly, for those of you playing at home, the problem statement is that we don't define any ways to sort of improve the discoverability of policy. And so it's pretty easy to set up systems where there are impenetrable rules occurring on objects that you own, that you don't know and possibly even can't know, which is a very bad place to be at for user experience. The point of Flynn's PR, that's the 2015, I think is the number, is to sort of tell a story about this and sort of illustrate some of the problems that can come up here. It's worth reading Flynn's story and stuff, and then reading through the comments on here. We've sort of worked through some of the things that we've all been thinking about this here in those comments, but you don't feel like you have to, because part of the point of what we're doing is to summarize those comments back into another change to the policy attachment gap. Now, this is going to mean that the policy attachment gap is going to be by like at least probably two, 3 or 4 times as large as any other gap. And so, but it is one of the things that I've sort of learned to be a bit more clear about as part of this process is that policy attachment, as Rob said, is a pattern, not an API. It's a pattern for making APIs, not an API itself. And so that's one of the reasons that doing design work for it is harder than you might think, and it takes longer. It's sort of, you need to both be specific but also not too prescriptive, which is a very fine balance to walk. It's one of the reasons that it's been sort of hard to figure this out. Additionally, the problem space that it is able to solve is sort of very large and complex, and so being able to select the right tool to sort of tell people the information that they need about using it is not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance. The update that I'm working on for that gap is to take the stuff that we've learned in the discussions, and that was sort of some of this stuff was already in my head, but I just never done a good job of writing it down, about how hard some of these things are, and try and actually come up with suggested solutions. Again, because this is a pattern rather than an API, we're not going to be able to say must and have conformance tests and have things core and extended in this. This is always going to be sort of a recommended pattern, and say, if you do this, then you must do this, or something like that is the best that we can do. And here are some recommendations for things to stop. Here are some problems that can happen, and here are some recommendations for ways to stop those problems from happening, is what we're sort of working on. The last link that's in this section is the discussion that Rob opened in discussion 2012, and that one is about collecting suggestions for ways that we can manage this issue. If you sort of feel like you understand the issue and would like to make a suggestion there or comment on one of those things, that would be much appreciated. I am pulling pretty heavily from that to come up with the possible solutions that we can then sort of evaluate in the text of the gap. So this gap is going to end up being a bit discursive, because it has to walk through the problems to be able to explain to people why we need to solve the problems and how it's not as simple as it might seem, before it can then get to here's what we're actually suggesting. So this update, the update that I'm adding is already adding thousands of words to an already lengthy gap. So those of you reviewing, I'm sorry in advance, but there's not much getting around this one. This one's got to be pretty detailed.
Yeah. That's a really good summary. It's gonna test the length of how long of a gap can we really handle here. But I think it will be good. I want to clarify, because I realize what I said earlier on may not have been very clear. We are very much saying that policy attachment, the model, had flaws in UX, especially discoverability, I think is the key one that just keeps on coming up over and over again. And so we're working to build on top of it by improving discoverability, improving things, adding things. Well, I'll get into ways we're trying to improve this, but I want to be very clear here that the core pattern in GAP 713, that the original policy attachment model, is going to continue. We're just going to build on top of that. Then seeing a question in chat. Yes, are we planning to introduce any policies that are part of Gateway API? Yeah, no definite plans yet. I think it would go a long ways in making it, easier to understand how to work with policy. But it's really on a case-by-case basis. I think initially we thought maybe timeouts would be that, but timeouts have actually landed on route. We've thought, well, maybe the backend TLS, the gateway to backend TLS, maybe that will be policy. That's still a possibility. I'm not sure, but that is very much one that could. But yeah, we don't have any definite plans. It's certainly a goal if the right use case comes up.
Yeah, I think that's the way I would put it here. It is a nice to have. I would definitely like to have some policy in like managed as part of the API bundle that you get, so that we can have very clear sort of directions about, because for that implementation, as it is an API, and so we can say you must do this and you must do that and you must do this, and we can try to illustrate why and how we would use the patterns that we've talked about in the GEP by actually having something concrete. That said, as Rob said, it's going to definitely be on case-by-case basis, and the problem here is that there's a very limited set of people who could currently build that thing. It's pretty much me and maybe Rob. But the part of the point of what we're trying to do is to expand that pool a little bit, so that so that we can have other, that we're not deadlocked on this. I'm waiting for Rob or my bandwidth.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. So I just want to highlight a couple of the concrete things that we're working on in addition to the GEP itself, and trying to update that to reflect current state and basically fold in the great discussion around Flynn's PR and the broader GitHub discussion. Also want to say that kubectl plugin is becoming a top priority. This is something that can solve many problems that we've experienced with Gateway API. Gateway API has kind of been on the cutting edge of a lot of these pain points for working with CRDs. And part of that is policy attachment. Part of that is we want to very easily see which policies attach to which gateway resources. That's a huge win and something that I think we can solve. But I think any kind of plugin is going to be much broader than that. There are a variety of things that I would love to provide if we could customize our kubectl get or describe output. We can't in near as good of a way as I would like, as you could in upstream APIs. So this provides us an opportunity to improve the UX throughout the API. So ideas very, very welcome. Gaurav is going to start on that. I think first step will be probably a GEP just to describe the process, but this is something that isn't going to be tied to Gateway API release process. It's just going to be something that can improve the overall UX when working with this API. And then one other very concrete change that we know we want to make is we need to update status. There are some big changes we can do in status, but one of the smallest, I think, least controversial changes we can make is update gateway class status. So implementations of Gateway API can simply publish via status the kinds of policies that they'll support. This will help a plugin to understand that, even if this policy is pointed at this resource, there may be a disconnect because maybe that controller is not, supporting that specific policy resource. So I think there's a lot of changes coming that will help improve this UX. But yes, the core of policy attachment is staying largely the same. We're just trying to build on top of it to make it a much better UX. Yeah. Okay, so that's a lot on policy. Any comments, questions before I move on?
One more thing I wanted to add there, that that gateway class status thing probably will actually be a list of all of the extensions, full stop. So policies, any extra filters or any other places where you plug into any of the extension points in the API, the intent will be to list all of the extensions there. Exactly how I do that, I'm not sure. I'm going to write a short gap on that, hopefully in the next week or so. That one actually will be short because I don't think there's much to discuss there.
Yeah.
Famous last words.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, anyone else?
Yeah. I'd be very interested to hear if anyone else has anything to say on this one. Mikhail asked in the chat, what about support for extended or implementation specific features in gateway class status? Yes, so that's the idea. So the idea here is that the gateway class status will have a list of all of the other resources that your implementation that are relevant for your implementation. So if you have like a custom filter or a params ref for your gateway class or a policy that works via policy attachment, then all of those will be listed there. In terms of support for extended features in conformance profiles, that's a different kettle of fish, and so it comes under the conformance profiles discussion. The idea is that everything that we have tests for will show up in the conformance profiles in one way or another. Maybe you've opted in to say you support it, maybe you haven't. But implementation specific is always going to be implementation specific. So it's a bit tricky to do anything too concrete there in terms of status. But we can at least, the intent is that the place where what I want to do is to have a place in gateway class status where you can say, here's all the API groups and resource names of relevant objects, so that someone can go kubectl get API group dot resource name -a and see all of the objects of that type in the cluster if they have access. But like that at least will then clue people in on things that they should go looking for your implementation. And so that will be something along the lines of, you must publish a list of all of these things in here, regardless of whether they're extended implementation specific or what.
Yep.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think I think these two things are going to play really closely together. I think the already existing conformance profiles gap is largely going to have under its umbrella what Nick was talking about of in gateway class status, the features that a gateway class claims to support would be there. I think the intent is for that to be all in the same gap, but Shane's not here to correct me, nor is Mattia. So, but yes, that is definitely a parallel effort that we should make sure is, compatible with and makes sense alongside what we're describing here. Yeah, good points. Cool. All right. I'll keep on moving then. But always don't hesitate to add things in chat if you or just speak up if you have anything. Next up, I added an issue today. I just wanted to start this for the sake of discussion and figured I'd bring it up here. But one of the things that we've run into as trying to build out any kind of automation around Gateway API and kind of traverse the tree in a more generic way is that, route parent status could really benefit from section names in the status itself. So for those, somewhat familiar with the Gateway API tree, routes attached to parents via parent ref. And in the case of gateway, you may just say, I want to target this entire gateway. And then the gateway may, you may only end up being attached to 2 out of, 10 listeners on that gateway, rough example. And it's remarkably difficult to understand and which of those listeners you've been attached to. Now you can just look and make sense of it. Well, okay, it's this protocol and this host name, so it must be these. But it's not straightforward for any kind of automation to make that. And so I think it would be safest if we added that actually to route status itself. So you could say very clearly as a controller, these are the section names I'm attaching this to. Haven't thought this through that much yet, but just wanted to get some initial ideas, feedback, whatever on this before I went any further with this. This feels like one of the gaps that we have right now as we're trying to traverse gateway API tree in a more generic way. Any thoughts? Anyone interested in this or have reasons to avoid?
I do have thoughts, but I want to see if anyone else does first. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Dave says it seems useful in chat. Yeah, so my thought is, yeah, like I agree that it does seem like it'd be useful, and that in general we do need to work. One of the discoverability things that the policy attachment discussion has come up with is that we need to avoid requiring squishy meat brains to actually parse the full tree and figure out what's actually happening. We need to have implementations be publishing what's actually happening in as many ways as possible. However, the downside to that is that it's very easy to run into scaling limitations, either about number of updates per second or object size. And so we just need to be careful when we do this, that we don't end up blowing out the object size too much with a lot of stuff in status.
Yep. Yeah, that's an issue that continues to bite us, is just, I think object size is probably okay here, but the real concern is, like what you're saying, is just fan out, right? You add one listener to a gateway and it ends up, affecting N routes. I think that may just be a necessary evil here, but yeah, just need to be very careful when we make changes like this.
Yeah, I'll try and put a response on there too. So
cool. All right. Well, if I don't hear anything in the next week or so, I'll probably just move forward with this one. Probably in form of a very lightweight get. But yeah, feedback is very welcome. All right, we've made it that far and we are into triage. So thanks everyone. I think we should have time for all of these. Just quick glance through at and as always, please don't hesitate to add things to triage. It's just a list of the things that I've found in a quick glance at what's going on right now. This is a PR from Brian that I think is really helpful. And I was amazed he made a markdown table that actually renders well in our reference docs as well. So who knew that that's a possibility? But this feels like a pretty useful mechanism to me to describe how rewrites work. Brian had some really good questions, and I think the specific one that was of interest is this specific case here that I want to highlight and ensure that this is compatible more broadly with other implementations. But if you have an incoming request to foo with a trailing slash and you have a prefix match on, slash foo, should the modified path also have a trailing slash? I believe this is just by default how it's going to work in Envoy today. I interested in other implementations as well here. I think this matches how I would expect this to work. But I do want to highlight it because it is, a significant nuance here. And there's some room that some implementations, especially non-Envoy based, may be doing something different here. So if you have a chance to take a look and see what your implementation is doing today, that would help. The spec itself right now is fairly open-ended as far as how this specific case would be handled. I think basically every other case is straightforward in my opinion, but this one is challenging. So yeah, just would appreciate some
Staying
extra eyes
trailing.
on this.
Trailing backslashes, man. Always biting us.
Yeah. Yeah. Dave, can you give standard lib redirects on trailing slash?
It's just like a weird nuance of the the muxer, the default muxer. I think if it's, I have to dig it up, but if it's a trailing slash or it's missing, if it's a prefix or something like that, it will do a redirect to the one without it. So I don't think it catches anyone, but it's just something that isn't particularly documented well.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. That's worth looking. That's worth us looking into. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Cool. Great to know. All right. Well, yeah, just please, this is really just a request for comment on this one. I think I may be the only one who's reviewed it so far, but additional reviews would be very appreciated. And especially if you're working on a non-Envoy based implementation, reviews would be very appreciated, because I want to make sure that this works broadly here. Cool. All right, next up is just, I think the very last thing I wanted to cover on this routability gap. I think this is basically mergeable or in the tiniest little bit of nits left. But right now, I think this is the only remaining open conversation, and it's saying that if a gateway is mutated, and gets into an invalid state, all three conditions accepted, ready, and programmed must be set to false. And this, I think we just need some broader guidance somewhere, and I don't know if we already have this, but I know there are some implementations that are going to take this state and not want to tear down the gateway itself. They'll want to, enter an invalid repair state, but not necessarily completely tear everything down. And I feel like we probably need some way to communicate that. That doesn't need to be solved in this gap, but this gap is maybe being very specific, more specific than we've been before about how a situation like this should be handled. So that's kind of why it's come up in this context. But yeah, that's I think the only little bit that feels left on this one. I think it's nearly resolvable with the state of comments at the end of the thread, but would appreciate just a little bit more discussion around this. Yeah. All right. Next up, or go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
I was just gonna kind of mention something I mentioned in the thread that I'm following, where if I see conditions switch to false, I wouldn't assume some underlying infrastructures like deprovision. And I kind of made the point where I don't want a half state where when I see a condition with an older generation, that sort of is meaningless to me. Because since then you can see the controller was turned off as an example. So that's why I kind of suggested to me this is more like the conditions are logical rather than being descriptive fully of the underlying implementation. You know what I mean?
I understand. I think sorry, I'll go. I understand, but I think for some of them, programmed in particular, ready is actually deprecated, so we do need to remove mentions of that from everywhere. But programmed in particular, it's actually defined as having in relation to the underlying infrastructure, that i.e. that there is underlying infrastructure and it has been programmed. And so if you are tearing it down, it has been programmed with that version of the config, right? So there's a few assumptions in there that, in the way that we define it. I understand that And this is just, again, one of those things about writing a spec is that we've got to go back to the way that we define things. And if it's not exactly the way that we define things, then someone's going to misinterpret it. And so, so I think it's really important to say, I suggested in that thread that we should have a way to say, hey, if you're an implementation, you may leave the infrastructure around if you want. Probably, as Rob said, I think that we need to have a standard way to handle that, like a way that you can have a condition that has the current observed generation and says, there's problems with the current observed generation of the spec. However, there is an old version sticking around somewhere, and you should check into that, right? Like, just we're not going to be able to tell you what the old version of the spec is, but like if the implementation is doing it, then there needs to be a way for that implementation to say, like, hey, there's some infrastructure lingering around that is not as is described in the spec. I mean,
I see. Yeah, it kind of sounds like you want a separate condition and programmed.
Yeah, that one is absolutely a separate condition. That's like an optional, extended at best, maybe even extended. It won't even be extended. It'll be implementation specific because there'll be no conformance tests. But it'll be if you do leave infrastructure lying around that is stale, that does not have the current spec, because the current spec is irreconcilable for some reason, then you must put this condition on as a UX matter. But again, like, I'm in general like -1 on that, because it means that the declarative system is no longer declarative. Like, but I acknowledge that not everybody is as willing to be as hardcore about that as I am, and some people prefer not to blow things up just because someone asks them to be blown up.
Yeah, I'd say it's a tough balance, but for infrastructure that takes minutes or longer to spin up and down, it's a pretty rough, and may spin up with a completely different IP or whatever. It's a pretty rough experience to have that happen for a accidental config mix up, whatever. I want to avoid blocking this gap on solving this problem, because it's unrelated. And so I was trying to be clear here that right now the language in this gap doesn't leave room for another way. I don't know that we need to solve the other way. We just need to leave that kind of out somewhere, that we can do something else here. Not quite sure how that works, but I want to make it clear that we don't need to solve that here.
Do you mind just making a suggestion?
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I had a bit of a suggestion on there as well. I might clean that up and sort of add it on to the end of the thread. Basically saying the meat of the suggestion will be implementations may do this, however, it has significant UX issues that remain unaddressed and will need to be addressed in a separate work item if you want to do that. So it does. It says you may, but be aware that there's problems with that approach.
Yeah. So I think what that basically means is we would I can follow up in a comment, but it sounds like this would become a should, and then we would have a may that describes there may be this other way that is undefined right now. Yeah, anyway, I'll follow up in a comment. Don't want to get derailed here. But yeah, thanks a ton for your patience in getting this gap through. I know it's had a ton of comments, and you've been working a lot on getting this one through. So I think we're almost there. Yeah. Cool. All right. Next up is this one from Arco. I don't know, is Arco on the call? No, he's not. So I won't spend much attention here. It's just a heads up that Arco is working on a new gap that seems simple enough, I think. But where Candace is working on basically something very similar to this, but from gateway to backend. This is from client to gateway. So yeah, this is really just defining goals and non-goals at this point, but seems straightforward. And I guess we can just ask more questions on the PR itself.
Yep.
And the final one I've got for today is, in-cluster gateway deployments. I don't know if John is on this call.
I'm here.
He is not. Oh, you are. Okay. No, this went through a long round of feedback, and then I think you pulled stuff out, so it's lighter weight now. Can you maybe just give an update of what we should be looking at now?
Can you look at the last comment? I want to make sure I'm not getting this mixed up, but I think this was pending re-review or more comments, and that I felt that I had addressed all the open comments, but there could be new ones on next iteration, of course. So if you're interested, please take another look at it when you have some time.
It's on my to review queue, John. That's a big queue. So sorry, I haven't got to it yet.
So just so I remember, this is basically setting three things. Like it's adding to the infrastructure stanza, which has finally merged, and this is adding labels, annotations, and some way to like attach to a service or some kind of infrastructure. Is that the scope of this one?
That's the API changes, I believe, but it's also defining a bit more of semantics on what you should do if you are in cluster deployment, which is not necessarily API changes, but more like, you should deploy a service that should be named this way, or I forget the details really. It's been a while since I got the weeds of it, but that's the intent. Is kind of like, if you were an in-cluster deployment, here's your guide on how you should implement things, and that involves a couple API changes, but also it will kind of be should probably live. I don't know if we have an implementation guide. If we do, then a follow-up to this should probably be to update that. If not, then maybe we should make one.
Yeah.
So there is an implementation guide that's very, very skeletal at the moment. That I have a long list of things that are on my list to put in there, but like how it is with writing a guide, it needs to be just so, and I have not handed bandwidth to wordsmith correctly.
Yeah. And one last thing here, I think one of the details in this gap is that it defines how annotations and
no, I don't think is that still in here, John, or did we take that one out?
This one has infrastructure.annotations and infrastructure.labels. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, right.
So and that's just saying these are hard-coded values that I'm going to pass through. Like it's not a list of, I want to pass, an allow list of these specific labels on the gateway.
Oh yeah, you'd put on here like, I want label foo equals bar,
Okay, yeah.
Super internal exert manager, internal annotation, XYZ, whatever.
Yeah. Got it. Okay.
This doesn't handle any of the stuff we talked about on one of the other gaps about using infrastructure on gateway class and how you would override those. Blah, 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 blah. There's a bunch of other stuff.
That is correct. It does not address that.
It does not need to. I'm not suggesting it should. I was just mentioning for Rob because that was also a conversation that we had very recently about labels and annotations and the infrastructure stanza. I don't think it should. I think that it's fine for this to just say there is a labels and annotation standard on the gateway's infrastructure, and it is, and those are straight copied onto any infrastructure that is provisioned as part of the gateway, which I think is acceptable. That way we don't have to worry about merging map strings and stuff like that until another day. Let's get this one in first.
Yeah. I think since this specific gap is so focused on in-cluster deployments, which is not primarily what I work on, it would be helpful to get reviews from others here as well, just to see that it's actually useful for other in-cluster implementations here. I can review and have reviewed some, but would definitely appreciate some reviews from people that are a little bit closer to implementations that would use this.
I think the TLDR here for other in-cluster implementations is one of the points of this is to make it so that, yes, there is a way that users can specify in a standard way, I am running on my cloud is running on AWS, and I want to be able to ask for an ALB or an NLB. And those things live in service annotations as of today. This is the way that you will be able to do that without having to write code to handle all of the possible annotations yourself. So I think that most in-cluster implementations will be very happy to have this in general. But yes, please have a look at it yourself. And as I said, I will be reviewing this one as well. But yeah, I definitely think as many people as possible should review this one.
Cool.
And anyone watching the recording, definitely hit that one as soon as you can if you're an implementer. I see there's a bunch of implementers have already reviewed it, but now's the time to review.
Yep. Great. Okay. Well, I think we've made it to the end of our meeting with a couple minutes to spare. Thank you, everyone, for great discussion. We'll talk to everyone next week. And until then, have a great one, and we'll see y'all online. All right. See ya.